Hello everyone, welcome to this video. This is part 3 to my introduction to Cisco CLI. So I'm sorry this video has come a bit later than I'd planned to get out for, so I apologize there for the delay. Nevertheless, I'm very excited about this lesson, and we've got quite a bit to cover. So if we get into the lesson, what we're going to be covering, well, continuing on from last lesson, we looked at several things. This lesson we are going to be looking at the accessing of the command line interface via web user interface. So one of the basically a modern newer way of accessing our familiar CLI, going through the web user interface rather than using a terminal emulator, so for example like PuTTY, or if you're using Mac OS, there's a built-in terminal app which you can use to be able to connect into a Cisco router or switch. But with web UI, it's you simply go into a browser, put the IP address of the router switch, and then we can from there access the CLI via the web user interface without using a terminal emulator, without using SSH or PuTTY. But we'll get into that. Next is CLI help features. So there's CLI comes with some great help features which assist administrators when it comes to the configuration. There's so many commands to remember, but when we use the help features, it makes life easier, because now we are being provided with input from the CLI which can guide us in the right direction of what command parameters to use, and also gives a brief description of what these parameters do, which is helpful. So CLI help features are also great. Now, number 3 is configuring Cisco Switch iOS. Now, the Switch iOS is obviously the Cisco iOS has many commands, but we'll look at the configuration of our Cisco Switch iOS, and then lastly storing, copying and erasing Cisco config files. So much to get into, so let's get started then. So firstly, web user interface. Now, as I was saying, web user interface, it's a graphical user interface. It's kind of like basically a web portal where we can manage our Cisco routers and switches. Now, it's also referred to as an HTTP the HTTP server of the router or switch. But you're probably more likely going to hear the term web UI. So web UI, when the web UI is configured, an engineer can use a web browser such as Safari, for example, to connect to the IP address of the router or switch. The web user interface allows management of the device, the single device, and includes a method to access the CLI without having to use Telnet or SSH or using any sort of terminal emulator app, which is great in that sense, because we can access it is just less work, less installation to do. We don't need to install a terminal emulator. We don't need to set up an SSH or Telnet client. But how do we actually access it? The web UI has many options. There's many sections. You've got a monitoring section, troubleshooting section, there's a configuration section, but it's none of those. It's the administration section, command line interface. I'm sorry I don't have a screenshot here to share with you, but it's the administration section and then command line interface to access the CLI. Now, CLI help features. So nobody memorizes all the commands when it comes to iOS. There's so many. However, we have help features to help us, guide us when it comes to what commands to use. So one of the basic help features is just using question marks. So here you can see I was logged into a switch, and I just enter the question mark, and it gives me a list of different commands that I can use there. So and then you'd normally follow these commands with parameters. So for example, show, you can do show spanning -tree to have an output of what is the bridge route, what is the route bridge, what is the priority of the switch, and different a more spanning tree information. Or you can have for example, commonly on a router, show IP interface brief, to see a description of all the interfaces running on the router. So there's many types of commands, but help feature, the question mark, allows us to basically get a list of what different commands are available for us to use. So it's pretty good in that sense. Now, another really cool feature of iOS is just being able to type in a command and then type a partial parameter in, and then you enter the tab key and it'll complete the rest. For example here, show Mac dash, that's all I entered, but I hit the tab key on the keyboard and then it just completes the command parameter for me. So it's great. It saves your fingers there, but it saves time, and it's a really useful feature. I think once you start using iOS and you start hitting that tab key, you'll see how much it makes your life easier. You know, especially when you're in the flow. It's really nice when you have these kind of features in handy, which save you time and allow you to, you know, focus your concentration on the actual configuration than just typing commands. So more time on configuration troubleshooting rather than just typing. So also, if you type a command and then the parameter and then a question mark after, iOS will give you specifically the parameters available for that command and that parameter. So all the, you could say, sub parameters, for example here where you have show Mac address dash table. Now that is a command followed by a parameter, but we want to see basically what are the sub parameters, what can we follow this to in order to obtain information. So for example, aging time is an important one, and aging time, one reason why it's so important is because 300 seconds, right, is how long it takes for a MAC address that's not being used to be removed from a MAC address table. If you have 300 seconds, which is 5 minutes, 5 minutes of a MAC address not being used means that it will be discarded from the MAC address table. It's really important to know that because when it comes to the CCNA style questions, you might see this in practice tests where they're specifically testing your knowledge of this fact, and you'll be given, like for example, a MAC address table snippet, a screenshot of a MAC address table, and the question is asking you to identify the correct statement. You've got 4 statements, and one of those statements might be that this, for example, let's say there were 5 MAC addresses in that table. One of the statements might be that this switch has learned 5 MAC addresses since it's been turned on. 5 since it's been running, since it's was last booted. It's only learned 5 MAC addresses, which is absolutely wrong. It's completely wrong. 5 MAC addresses is not necessarily just learn 5 MAC addresses, because switches, they will discard MAC addresses that have not been used in the last 5 minutes. Anything, it's been 5 minutes, the MAC address not being used, out. It gets out. It's removed. So to say that, so this statement is completely wrong, that it's only learned 5 MAC addresses. To say that with absolute conviction would be completely wrong, because there is absolute doubt there, because the switches by their nature will remove any MAC addresses that have not been used for the last 300 seconds, 5 minutes. They will be removed. So we cannot categorically say, with conviction that that is the case. So that's why that statement would be wrong there. So it's always important to keep that in mind. Aging time, dynamic, interface, static. So you got more subparameters there to use. Now moving on, show commands. Now show commands, by far the most popular iOS command that we've used. Sorry, I'm just going to check. Yes. So I was just checking that this lesson's actually recording. I have problems sometimes where I think I'm recording, but it's not actually recording. So show commands are by far the most popular iOS command. Now the show command can be used with a whole range of parameters to find about different iOS features. Now there's so many variations of this show commands being used. So show Mac address dash table, show Mac address table, or show IP interface brief, or show spanning dash tree, or show IP OSPF neighbors. You know, there's so many variations of the show commands that are used on routers and switches. So it's important to obviously be obviously familiar with as many show commands. It's good to be as familiar with as many show commands that we but even if you don't know, you can use show and then hit the tab key, and I also will give you an output of what show commands are, show command parameters, sorry, are available. So show commands very, very important. Now debugging, right, it's, you know, when you think debugging, normally we think in the context of programming, right? Programming, troubleshooting code, code errors. When it comes to Cisco world and Cisco networking, debugging, the debug command is used for logging, is used for real-time logging of errors, but also just generally in terms of the device operation and the traffic generation, or the traffic being received. So it's basically real-time logging. One description I read about debug commands, and I thought it's quite a good description actually, is that it's basically like a live video camera feed. And so that's kind of another way to think of it as well. But basically, it's real-time logging of what's happening. You know, you're constantly being fed information about, hey, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened, this happened on the switch, this error, this traffic's been generated, this traffic's been received. Now, you can turn on debugging for a particular type of information that you're looking for. So, for example, here, debug IP ICMP, and that means you have ICMP debugging messages keep coming to you. Now, one thing that could be annoying with debugging, right, is that debugging can be particularly annoying if you don't use something called logging synchronous commands. If you don't use that, what will happen is you're doing your configuration, and then in the middle of your configuration, you're getting debug messages, and it gets so frustrating because it's all chopping up everything. You know, you've got some command output here. For example, you want to view a MAC address table. You get half a MAC address table, then you got debugging about ICMP, and then you've got the rest of your MAC address table. It doesn't look clean. Your command output doesn't look clean. So using logging synchronous can help stop that, because then the log messages will only occur at those natural breaks between your command outputs. So definitely very important to use there. No debug ICMP, so that IP ICMP is just a way to turn it off. So you just simply put that negative no there in front of it, and that stops the ICMP debugging messages from coming. Now, something I really want to emphasize, because this can break your production environment, is using debug all. Now, you don't really want to be debugging every single operation happening in your router or your switch. No. So very, very careful, guys. Debug all. This can crash your device. Highly don't recommend doing that, particularly especially in production environment. So moving on, just want to talk about, you might remember from the last lesson we looked at was either part 2 or part 1, but we looked at going from user mode to enable mode, right? So you've got user mode, then you've got enable mode or privilege exec mode, okay, where you've got a high level of permissions. You type enable to go into from user mode to enable mode. Now, if you want to go back out, you use disable to go back to enable mode. So that's important to know that. And when it comes to global configuration mode, we use configure terminal, right? Configure terminal. And when we want to come out, we use end or control Z. Okay, control Z. Sorry, I say Z. I'm British. We say Z in the United Kingdom, but obviously, those for you watching the United States, Z, control Z. So end and or control Z we can use. So I've used end here. Now that takes you back into enable or privilege exec mode. Using right, so line console modes is an important sub mode in iOS, and you can use line console 0 to enter that. So in global configuration mode, line console 0 take you to that line console mode. Something very important. Now I want to talk about memory types. Memory types in Cisco iOS, for Cisco devices, sorry, we have 4 that we need to know about. So firstly, RAM, flash memory, ROM and non-volatile RAM. So RAM stands for random access memory. You know, you're probably familiar with this because see, RAM, we have RAM in our PCs as well and laptops. But RAM stores in the Cisco world and on Cisco devices, this stores the running configuration file. So when you're hitting your commands and you're configuring, for example, spanning tree, you are what's that configuration is being stored on the running config file. That's the config that's being worked on, that you're working on while devices are operating. Now, that cannot, and so it's very important to save that into here, the non-volatile RAM. But I'll talk about that. So RAM's also known as the DRAM. So in case you see the term DRAM and you're thinking, what on earth is DRAM? Dynamic random access memory is the same as random access. It's the same as random access memory. Just another term for it. Flash memory. Okay. Now, flash memory is not an abbreviation for anything. Flash memory stores the iOS image. Now, it's also used to store backup copies of config files. Backup copies and config files. So that's why the actual image is being stored. Now, flash is where is the flash? Flash is a chip or it's a removable memory card in the switch. It's a chip or a removable memory card. ROM. Now, ROM read-only memory. Sorry about that. My phone rang there. Read-only memory. It uses. The purpose of read-only memory, now you might be also familiar with this because it's used in the PC context as well, but read-only memory for a Cisco device, that's storing the bootstrap program or the boot helper program, okay, which is coded when that switch is first powered on. Now, that is loaded when the switch is first powered on, not coded. The bootstrap program finds the full iOS image and it does the job of loading that iOS into the RAM. Okay, so I will show you in a diagram, and hopefully that will make a little bit more. Hopefully that will help illustrate this. But the bootstrap program is going to find our iOS image and then load that into RAM. Okay, well, don't worry, but I will show you in an upcoming diagram. Non-volatile RAM. Now that stores our startup config file. So it's very important when we configure our RAM, when we're doing configuration on our running config, we use we need to use a command called copy running -config startup-config. Copy running -config startup's all one word, -config, to save our running configuration into the startup configuration. So what's being stored, what this running config stored in the RAM, remember when the switch is powered off, that RAM will be deleted. Okay, so anything that we've saved, any changes we've made, needs to go into here, otherwise we lose all our changes. Copy running -config startup-config. Okay, now the switch reloads iOS, the startup config is stored, sorry, that's a typo, that's stored in the non-volatile RAM. So I wanted to illustrate what RAM does. So RAM, the bootstrap program is in the RAM, stored. Okay, now when the switch is powered on, our ROM, right, is going to look for our iOS image, and that gets okay, it's going to look for the iOS image, and then it will load iOS into the RAM. Okay, switch powered on, your ROM finds iOS image, and that iOS image will load into the RAM. Okay, so moving on. I want to talk about ROM monitoring. The ROM monitoring mode. It's very important to know about this. Might not necessarily be asked about the CCNA, but generally it's good to know, especially when you're working with the switch or even a router. But if you're working with the switch and you need to, for example, reset the password, and you don't know what the password is, and you're thinking, oh no, I can't get into the switch now. Well, you can, but you need to access ROM on. So firstly, There's two ways that I know of that you can get into this. One is enable config terminal config reg -xox x 0x0 exit reload. As one way I know. The other way is interrupt the boot sequence. Now this is the way I did. This is actually a screenshot of me when I had a Cisco device that I was trying to access. I could not. I didn't know the password. This was something that was given to me. I didn't know the password in, and I needed to reset the password. So what I did was I interrupted the boot sequence and I used the control break key. Now, older keyboards would have had that break key. Now today, you might not see that break key anymore. I don't think you really find keyboards like that anymore. However, if you have a terminal emulator, for example, like Putty, I believe you right click on the top bar in Putty, you'll get a list of options, and in one of those options you'll see a break key option. So that's the way I did it. I kept pressing the break key, using that by right clicking on the Putty bar, the top bar in Putty, and then actually going into selecting the break option several times, and that got me into ROM-on. And then from there I could reset the password of that switch. So ROM-on is a firmware. It's run when the Cisco router switch is powered up and reset. It's stored in the ROM and is used for troubleshooting and device recovery if your ROM fails to load. And like I said, it can be used to bypass that startup config to reset a forgotten password. Now this is what I did here. Now, copying or erasing configuration files. Now, this is something very, very important. And like I said, copy running -config, startup -config. We use that to back up the running config to the startup config file. Very, very important, because we don't want to lose any changes that we make. Now, if you want to get rid of all existing configurations, in the startup config file, you can use the following 3 commands. Okay, you can use write erase, erase startup -config, erase nvram. You can use these 3 to get rid of any existing configuration in your startup config. Okay. Now you want to be careful. Make sure that you got authorization and you're definitely very sure about this before you decide to use write erase, erase startup -config, erase nvram. That will delete your startup config file. It will wipe the startup config file. So you want to be very careful and be sure before you do anything like that. Now let's got a short practice test for you guys. So I hope you're ready. Practice test question 1. What is privilege mode also referred to as? Okay, just pause this video for 10, 20, 30 seconds, how long you think you need, and have a think, and then play the video back. So I'm going to give it 5 seconds for you guys to pause the video, and then please resume the video to view the answer. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's view the answer. That is enabled mode. So enabled mode and privileged exec mode are the same thing. Question number 2. What does the ROM do? I'll give you 5 seconds to pause the video, and then please resume when you're ready. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So ROM, what does the ROM do? Well, ROM's job is, one, it stores the bootstrap program. That bootstrap program is used to find the iOS image when the switch is powered on, and that iOS image will load the bootstrap will find that image, and then the bootstrap will load that image into the RAM. Okay, switch powers on, bootstrap program finds iOS, bootstrap program will load the iOS image into the RAM, loads it into the RAM. So that is what is happening there. Question number 3. Where is the startup configuration of a device stored? Where is the startup configuration of a device stored? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I hope you've had a think about this. Startup configuration of a device is stored in the non-volatile random access memory, the NVRAM. That's where it's being stored. Question number 4. How does one access the CLI via the web user interface of a Cisco switch? How does one access the CLI of the web via the web user interface of a Cisco switch? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So it's the administration option and then command line interface. That's what you need to use. Not monitoring, not troubleshooting, not configuration sections. Question number 5. True or false? The parameters for connecting to a Cisco switch via terminal emulator is 9600 bits per second, even 8.1. 9600 bits per second, even 8.1. I'll give yourselves 5 seconds to pause and then resume the video. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So I hope you've had to think about this. The answer is, this is false. So the correct answer was 9600 bits per second and 9600 bits per second, meaning no hardware flow control, 8 for 8-bit ASCII, and then 1 for 1 stop bit. Okay, so that was the options we needed to use. Sorry, that was the answer there. Is to use is 9600 bits per second, no hardware flow control, 8 for 8-bit ASCII, 1 for 1 stop bit. Okay, not even. So it was almost there, but instead of even, the answer was none. Okay, so important analogy, if you remember the story from my previous lesson, was in either lesson 1 or lesson 2, we talked about this analogy. So it's a little story, but I think it captures some of the key facts about the default terminal emulator settings that we need to know about. So think you have a gentleman called Mr. Terminal. He wins $9,600 in the lottery, but he has hardly any financial control and spent 8 to 1 of it. He's given 8 to 1. He spent 8 to 1 of his money. Okay, so he's not really he's not really managed his finances very well there. So what does that story mean in terms of the default terminal emulator settings? When Mr. 9600 winning $9,600 represents 9600 bits per second, no hardware flow control. Okay, that was represented by Mr. the gentleman not having hardly having any financial control. If you see here, what this abbreviates to is the same HFC. 8-bit ASCII, that meant spending 80%. 1 stop bit represented that 8 to 1, the one portion that he had not consumed. And no parity bits and 1 stop bit can also mean sharing with no one. But I think this really captures the essence of, it captures the key points when it comes to these default terminal emulator settings. Just a little story to help memorize those key facts, because like we can see here, this can get tricky when our memory of this is not solid. So excuse me, last question. Sorry, I kind of showed the answer there already. What command would you use to save your configuration? I'll give you those 5 seconds. Please take 5 seconds and then please view the answer. What command will you use to save your configuration? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So it's copy running -config startup -config. That is the command we use. So key takeaways from this lesson: you can reload the switch from the enable mode. You can reload the switch from the enable mode, privileged exec mode. SSH encrypts all data exchange, including passwords, but Telnet encrypts nothing. RAM is used to store the configuration used by the switch when it is up and working. Copy running -config startup -config will copy the running config from the RAM into the non-volatile RAM. Console mode doesn't need a password. Brings us to the end of the lesson, guys. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you benefited from it. I apologize again for the delay, and I think there's still a few things that weren't covered as much as they could have been, or not covered. Okay, but I've tried really to capture as much as I can from this important section of the CCNA course in these last 3 videos. So this one, and then the 2 that were uploaded not this weekend gone, but the weekend before that. So I think there's still a little bit that's missing, so I apologize for that, but I hope I really tried hope you still benefited from this video. And as far as if there's any, I'll have a look back and see if there was anything missing, and we'll make a part 4 for those bits that were missing. But I think I've covered most of what this section is about. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in a future video. Thank you guys. Goodbye.